All right, Ann and Chris, thank you for being here. As we were just saying, I mean, this has been a wild journey for me, and you guys, we've had a couple of talks, and so I've shared some of not just my own, but my family's journey with the transgender community and with our employee. That was really sort of my intro to, and frankly, the first close person in my life is transgender. Mm-hmm. And so it's been good to get to know y'all and really kind of lead me down this path of just understanding and hearing is all sides, right? And as you all can imagine, there's a lot of, or they're very polarizing sides. And it's I think the thing that has struck me is it is, I've been in the midst of some conflicts and some drama in my life. Breaking news. This one is red hot, white hot. Mm-hmm. And it's almost become another story for me, how, and this is the conversation I would love to have with y'all, like, everybody, it's ideal to think about some middle ground. As I've walked this journey, it's hard for me to imagine that there is a middle ground. And so just today, if we could just, talk through some of the issues. I mean, obviously we know the issues, right? You have the science side, you have inclusion, you have sports, you have the societal side, you have the youth sports, you have the elite level, mm-hmm. You have politics, and then all the other slippery slopes that I've intentionally tried to avoid, whether that's things like puberty blockers or bathrooms, or you guys know this. You'll hear things like autogynephilia. Like that's not. I'd like to keep this focused on sports. So what might be good, just because this audience is probably just getting to know you guys, I know y'all's stories, so. But I'd love to hear it again. Just tell the audience, how you guys came to be, and then we'll go from there.
Sure. Do you want to go first? Do you want me to?
Go for it.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having both Chris and me on the podcast. It's been really wonderful and really interesting to hear your journey as an ally. And I think actually what has been important for both me and Chris on this journey is to really think about how so many people have questions that you might not know a transgender person, might be confused about all these conversations that are happening. So it's just so great that we're having an opportunity to demystify some of that. In terms of me and my own story, so I am the Director of Policy and Programs for Athlete Ally. My name is Ann Lieberman. I use they, them pronouns. And at Athlete Ally, we are a nonprofit organization, and we work to ensure that everyone, no matter their sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression, can experience the life-saving power of sports. And in addition to my role at Athlete Ally, I am also a Muay Thai coach. I'm a former fighter. I'm a 3-time national champion in 3 different weight classes. And I also had the opportunity many years ago at this point in the mid-2000s to travel to Thailand on a Fulbright fellowship to do research about gender equity in Muay Thai. And so I really live and breathe this every single day. And one of the things, especially over the past 5 years, that has been so heartbreaking for me as a non-binary athlete, as a coach, as somebody who is thinking about so much of this personally and professionally, is the way in which my identity, my humanity has been weaponized and turned into a political conversation when in fact it isn't one. And I think it's a really important thing to talk about and center the humanity of these conversations, because one of the reasons why these debates get so incredibly polarizing is that we forget that there are real people. And if there are folks listening who have never met transgender people, you have 2, here with you today. And so I really hope that this is an opportunity for people to learn and keep an open mind and stay curious, because at the end of the day, the fear and the misrepresentation of transgender people, of issues in women's sports, is hurting all of us.
Mm-hmm. And just, Chris, before you go, I think that's right, and I agree with that. But what I have seen, and not but what I have seen is, and this obviously hits home for me. I mean, this idea of cancel culture, cancel, shame, and fire. And I want to talk a little bit about that later on. But just to sort of put a pin in that for a sec, like it's been real for folks that have said they have stated their views, right? That are many would argue are well researched and based in fact, or based in science, or based in biology, that have paid a price, which, to me that's not, I mean, what I heard you say is there's some middle ground here. And I think it would be hard for some folks to imagine that. So that'll be interesting and good to get into.
Yeah. My name is Chris Mosier. My pronouns are he and him, and I'm the founder of transathlete.com, which is my sort of day job of running that website. It's a resource for athletes, coaches, parents, administrators, basically anyone, to find trans-inclusive policies at various levels of play. And it's been a great opportunity to transform into more activism work. It started off as a resource, and really over the last several years has become the place that people go to figure out ways to take action when anti-trans policies come up. In addition to doing that, and sort of the reason why I did that is because I am a transgender athlete, and I was assigned female at birth. I was raised and socialized as a little girl, and I grew up playing girls and women's sports. So women's sports has played a huge part in my life. And I feel very passionately about making sure that everybody has the opportunity to get all of the amazing experiences that people get from playing sports, especially as kids. I was a 3-sport all-conference athlete in high school, wanted to play college basketball. And when it came time to actually do that, I realized that I couldn't put myself in a position where I would be able to listen to a coach say, "Hey, ladies," or "Let's go, girls." And at the same time, at that time in my life, I didn't have a connection to the trans community. I didn't know what the word transgender really meant as it would maybe apply to me, because I didn't see people like me out in the world. I didn't see transgender men out in the world, in media, in movies. And I definitely didn't see transgender people in sports. And I was at a point in my life where I had just come back into sport. I was experiencing some success in triathlon, and found that there was a real discrepancy for me in winning my first race, but being embarrassed to tell people that I won because it was in the women's category. And so sport has served as both my safe space when I was a kid, and the place where I learned all of the amazing values that people get from playing sports. And then at the same time, it's become this place where it now is a really hostile place for trans and non-binary people. And I think that sport is a vehicle for social change. And if we can create more inclusive environments in our sporting context, that will just have a net positive effect on the world. So I'm excited to be talking about this. And I know that we'll get into some things, but at the end of the day, I think every young person deserves to have that opportunity that I had as a kid to really learn about themselves, learn about working with other people, and gain the confidence that kids get from playing sports.
Right. And so when did the journey of actual transition, I'm just really curious, because for those that are just listening, the first time we got on a Zoom, I saw Chris, and I knew enough of the stories. I would literally put my hand in a fire to say, they're like our employee, there are times you sort of see, and I hope I'm not crossing over the line here or being inappropriate, but when I see Chris, this is, I would never believe that you were assigned female at birth. Ever. Before you
answer the question, so I actually love that you said that, because we have in our culture, in our minds, very particular ideas of who trans people are, who trans men are, who trans women are, who non-binary people are. And when we think of media representation, how trans women are being portrayed, it's always a very particular archetype of a woman who is a bigger woman. And we know that women are all different shapes and sizes. But so it's really important to know that people might not think they've met a transgender person, but most likely you have, because we look all different ways. We're all different types of people. And so I think what you shared is a very human and very real response to seeing, I mean, this mustache alone. How could you?
I tell people, I'm like, wait, hang on. I said, no. I said the dude had a handlebar mustache.
Yeah.
And people are like, what? I'm like, no, I was looking. I put my reading glasses on, everything. I know for a fact.
Is that why the glasses went on?
I was looking. I was like, that is. I'm just being totally honest.
Yeah.
But sorry to cut you off, Chris. So that began sort of after college, or
yeah. Yeah, my understanding of myself started at a very, very young age. And I'd say that's very typical of young kids from what we know. You know, young kids have a sense of gender between the ages of 2 and 3 and can identify themselves as either a boy or a girl, or feeling like maybe they're neither at probably about 4 to 5 years old based on the research that we've seen. So I had that same experience of being that young kid, of knowing exactly who I was, but not having the language or the terminology to tell my parents or to tell my classmates. And so my earliest memories are of just being me. Like, I was always Chris, and I was always just like kind of the weirdo off the court of the field. But in sports, I was loved and accepted and embraced because I found that validation that my classmates got in the classroom or on the playground. And I leaned fully into that at a very young age. So I think, you know, my discomfort in other areas was really what made me a good athlete. And I took that with me through, you know, after college. Right. I missed that experience of playing college basketball, and I wanted to get back to sports. So I came back in through running, started in triathlon. I made Team USA in 2015 for the first time, and challenged the International Olympic Committee policy on transgender athletes to get that changed. And then have been on Team USA 7 times now, 3-time men's national champion in race walking and duathlon, and have All-American, men's All-American in duathlon. So I've really been able to experience this amazing career once I was able to tell people who I was.
Yeah. And what was, because there's been a couple of, and I've read a lot of the IOC stuff, and obviously they're pulled, as they should be, pulled into this issue or this debate with, I think, from my view, and some of the conversations even early on, I said, look, I'd ask the IOC or ask the NC2A, or if you were ask the NFL, you would ask the governing body. And so I read the framework on fairness and inclusion, and it didn't. I will admit, I'm a little jaded when it comes to governing bodies like that. I didn't take a lot from that. What I kind of took was, you guys decide, point to the sports or point to the countries and say, you guys figure it out. We're not going to touch it. But I know there's been I think there was something in the early 2000s and maybe some updates since then.
Yeah, that's exactly right. For currently, a lot of these organizations that previously we would have looked to for our information, like the IOC, like the NCAA, have decided that they want to allow a sport-by-sport approach to this conversation. And it's been positive and negative for a lot of people, because it does allow sport governing bodies the autonomy to create policies that work for them. But at the same time, we're not seeing the investment in the research and in the actual practice of putting together a panel and of making decisions about what those athletes should be doing. And we're seeing a lot of copy and pasting between these organizations, where they'll take a policy that maybe works okay or is not great for another sport, and then adopt that policy without talking to transgender athletes, without reviewing the scientific evidence, and without doing their own work on creating policies. So across the country, across the world, sport policy is really a patchwork right now. And that's from the youth level, just looking at the 50 states and how those policies look for young people to play sports.
Well, that's how it gets political, right? Because if they don't do something, in my view, they don't do something. And by the way, on the research part, it's in the framework. They did the same thing. Well, this just needs more research, and you guys go find somebody to fund it. This is the way I read it. And so if it's hands off and head in the sand, then it's going to get political, right? You're going to have, just trying to look at this from a 360-degree view. I mean, you're going to have the Greg Abbotts and the Alabamas, and that's going to happen if you don't. I think that's what we're seeing.
Absolutely. And to add a few things about the framework and also the previous consensus statements, in reality, the sport governing bodies could always make whatever decisions they wanted to. And the IOC has not traditionally stepped in ways that I think we would like them to across a whole range of issues, not just eligibility criteria. But the interesting piece about this 2021 framework, and we were as Athlete Ally very involved in that process, primarily helping to bring trans athletes to the IOC to consult, to talk about their lived experiences with the eligibility criteria, is that what I think the IOC did a good job of doing was actually consulting with every single person on all sides of the issues, every organization, athlete group, athlete council, scientist, to really take a deep dive into what does fair and inclusive eligibility criteria look like. And one of the big things missing from that framework are testosterone thresholds. And one of the reasons that they took out testosterone thresholds was because testosterone, or any piece of an athlete's biology, is not the be-all end-all of competitive advantage. So it really was an effort to think more holistically about competitive advantage. But again, with not enough guardrails, we are seeing very mixed approaches from international federations, and certain international federations essentially acting with impunity and doing whatever they want, even despite research that shows that the policies that they're putting in place are not evidence-based or not rigorous. So it's not
dissimilar to American politics, right? I mean, if a president really doesn't want to mess with something, or his administration, he or she says, let the states decide.
Right.
It's very similar.
Mm-hmm.
And as I've gotten in, the research side, to me, it's complicated, right? It's. I mean, I've obviously read all the materials you guys sent, but at the end of the day, we're talking about a huge story here, right? This is a very big story. We've seen it evident just in the last 2 days with people knowing that we're going to have this conversation. I'm like, I don't know. Let's go. Let's be fearless. Let's have the conversation. Let's bring everybody to the table. It's a big issue. And there's not a lot out there as I've walked this journey and asked people like, well, is there something around the corner? Is there, are we close? And you don't get good answers there. And it, you all know the story. I mean, it goes down to the population, the types of, the exact type of, to be specific and to be exact, you have to test similar people, right? And that's been an issue, as you all know, along the way with, in this community, testing non-elite transgender athletes or trans female athletes that are different. They're not couch potatoes, but they're walking 30 minutes a day. So are we getting real data?
Exactly. And I have a feeling that we both smiled at the same time because we're probably thinking the same thing. But do you want to talk a little bit about Renee Richards?
Oh, yeah. So, when I came out in 2010, there were no other trans athletes for me to look to, no trans men, but I'm certainly not the first transgender athlete that came out publicly. Renee Richards famously came out in the 1970s. And when she came out, we heard this is the end of women's sports. Now we have a transgender athlete. Trans athletes are going to dominate. This is the end of the women's category as we know it. And here we are 50 years later, having these same conversations, hearing the same things on social media that people said to her but without the evidence of any sort of domination or takeover in women's sports. It's just now there are a couple more people who are visible in athletics, and they are being victim to the same sort of talking points that we heard back then.
And also what just kills me in my heart as a diehard women's sports fan is we are not actually addressing the issues we need to be addressing in women's sports. I mean, we do a lot of work with the Women's Sports Foundation, founded by Billie Jean King in the mid-1970s. And they've been doing research for decades about the challenges and opportunities facing women and girls in sport. So we're talking about decades of research about uneven implementation of Title IX, equal pay, sexual harassment and abuse in sport, which is, in my opinion, the biggest issue facing women and girls in sport, especially at younger ages. I mean, the list goes on. And in the decades that WSF and others have been doing research, nowhere in any of that research talks about trans women and girls, because those are not the biggest challenges women and girls are facing. And so what concerns me is that we're actually harming all women and girls by being distracted from what we all need to be working together on in terms of gender equity in sports.
And so how do we answer, because the New York Times article, it's a couple of years old, it came out right after Leah Thomas won the NCAAs, but Renee was quoted in the article that she's reconsidered her opinion and says, I now, we're really time stamping ourselves 40 years ago. I hate that kind of shit. It's like, I hate it. Like, you're like, oh my God, that was, you talk about things that were 10 years ago. Like, we just had slightly off subject. We had the 10-year anniversary of doing the Oprah interview, and people were like, wow, was that long ago? And I was like, yeah, it was 10 years ago, which means feels like yesterday, but that means tomorrow or 10 years from now is going to feel like tomorrow.
Yep.
But she's reconsidered her opinion or come out publicly and said, in hindsight and upon further review, I don't think it's fair. How do we answer that? Right. And obviously Caitlyn Jenner been very outspoken. She didn't need to say it on this show. She's said it 100 times. How do we reconcile that?
I think that there are a lot of people who have similar concerns. Even within the LGBTQ plus community, we see that there are people who identify as other parts of the LGBTQ plus community who are not supportive of trans people. And certainly there are trans people who are incredibly transphobic themselves. And I would say that is, by a lot of different circumstances, including things that we heard growing up. Like myself as an example, I grew up in a household where I heard racial slurs and I heard homophobic comments. And when, you want to timestamp us here, when Ellen DeGeneres came out, I don't even know what year that was. I was very young, but I remember hearing about it in my house and not in a positive way. And so there were so many messages that I got from my family, from kids at school, from teachers about the way that I was showing up. And even though I didn't know that I was trans, being a little gender nonconforming kid and going into high school and still being an outsider and getting all of those messages that I didn't belong, that it wasn't okay for me to dress a certain way or to like certain things. And all of that becomes internalized transphobia. So even as I was on my journey of understanding myself, there were years where I didn't want to be in a group of other trans people. Like if I was going somewhere and I saw someone who was gender nonconforming, as opposed to being attracted to them, of being like, this is community, maybe we have something in common, maybe we can chat, maybe I can find support here. I was trying to stay as far away as possible because I was afraid of what that would mean for me if people saw me like that person. And so I think that we have a lot of differing opinions, even in our community. And I think that also it depends on how old people are too and how much exposure they have to what's happening now on the ground for young people in these states. I feel disconnected as somebody who has been out of school for, decades now, 2 decades, right? At least of saying that I don't know what it's like to be in the classroom because my younger brother, who was 18 years younger than me, had a very, very different high school experience than I had. He had queer kids in his class. He had exposure to the trans community in a positive way. And I never saw any of that. And so we all, and I know that my parents didn't see that, and my grandparents definitely had very different views on, even just on terminology, right? I just used the word queer, which is a word.
We talked about it once. I was like, oh, I thought that was a bad word.
Yeah. And so for your listeners, though,
right.
A queer is a term that I use
That's
positively.
the Q in LGBTQ plus.
Yep. And I use it very positively, and a lot of people in our community do, and it's been reclaimed. But we also know that there's a deep history of hurt and hatred behind that word. I grew up playing Smear the Queer, where somebody in the neighborhood had a ball and they were the queer, and everybody tried to tackle them. Those are the types of situations that happened for me as a kid that caused the internalized homophobia and transphobia. And just this idea that if I was myself, that I wouldn't be safe in this world. And now we're in a situation where kids across the country are in 22 states. They are unable to play the sports that they love just because of who they are, because they're transgender. And in 20 states in our country, maybe those kids can't access gender affirming healthcare that is age appropriate and medically necessary for them.
And what is that? That's a very sensitive part of this, and it is a slippery slope on that one. I mean, but just out of curiosity, let's just slightly slip a sec. I mean, what is age appropriate? Like, is there a consensus here, or is it y'all's opinion? Or I have 5 kids, right, all the way from 13 to 23. So those are things you think about, or you can think back to, like. Is there something, because there's other folks that, they'll paint a pretty gory picture about, you guys know the story, somebody that potentially or possibly decided too young and was given, whether it's, puberty blockers or Lupron or anything that is irreversible. And there's other countries too, that's here in the United States. There's other countries like England that have this sort of watchful waiting period where, okay, I got it, but can we just give it some time, which sounds reasonable. Like, is there some safe place there?
Do you want me to start?
Yeah.
So a few things on this point. I think, again, there are a lot of misunderstandings and misconceptions about what gender affirming healthcare for trans youth specifically is. And there's a whole association called the World Professional Association of Transgender Health. That is a group of doctors from around the world. There's a board in the US, a board in different countries that set standards of care for trans people and trans youth. And none of those doctors are advocating for kids to transition before puberty, any kind of these extreme things that we often hear. That is
because there must be. They're using some example, or they're regardless of what the board says, right? There must be some. It only takes a couple for for these things to catch attention.
And I think often what happens there is an aspect of that young person's story catches attention and it's misrepresented, which is what we're seeing over and over again. But I think when we think about the importance of gender affirming care and all of the major medical associations that are on board with gender affirming care for trans youth, we're talking about not only medical care, but mental health services. So again, there's a misconception that it's very focused on people's bodies, and we need to think holistically about how we're supporting trans youth.
And I would even say that it's focused on surgery. We're seeing a lot of these bills that are introduced across the country trying to ban certain surgeries. So lower surgery, top surgery, all sorts of things that never happen for youth. I don't know of any young people who are getting vasectomies, but that's part of the language in these bills. And so I think the picture that has been painted by politicians when they're introducing this and having these quote unquote debates has really been focused on altering a young person's body. But gender affirming care for young people is more like social transition. So there are several different ways to transition as a trans person. One of them is social. So that would be changing your name, pronouns, clothing, your expression, maybe the locker room or restroom that you use. That requires no changes to a young person's body, but can have drastically increase their confidence, their sense of belonging, and reduce their anxiety, depression, and thoughts of suicide. And so, that's something that's very easy for people to support, to just let people dress how they want to dress and call them what they want to be called. and you mentioned puberty blockers, so I do want to address that as well. These are decisions that are made in collaboration with doctors, with mental health professionals, with parents and guardians, and the young person to decide a course of action that's important and appropriate for that young person. So there's not a universal, like when you hit 10 years old, you do this, right? Like some people never want to medically transition. And that's a valid way to be a trans person as well. And some people, want to do things and will do them at different points in their...
What's the stat I heard? Was how many people actually, and again, this just goes back to really my own journey. I said this to our employee. It's your mind goes there. When I was told, when they told me that they're transgender, my mind goes there. I said, and we work very closely. We sit side by side. You guys know the story without getting too much into it. We were in a situation, and I said, so, like how what's next? Like, how far? I think I made like a hand gesture. I was like, so are we like being a complete dipshit? But I was like, so, and
Well, can we talk about why that's a dipshit move, though? I think that's an important thing. Like, let's use your error just to help your listeners along, right? Like the focus on bodies is extreme, and generally,
I'm
just being honest. And I fully confess,
which is why
I don't love it, but
which is why this is a great bridge to this conversation of focusing on people's bodies. And so it becomes extremely troubling to me when we're focusing on young people's bodies and we have lawmakers who are focusing attention on essentially kids' genitals and their chromosomes and hormone levels, right? But primarily we've seen really because when you talk about a kid, what's in a kid's pants, that is extremely offensive, which then makes it a very divisive topic. So we've seen this medical conversation and the sports conversation really center on what's in people's pants. And this is, the fact that you would have that curiosity, as so many people do. I can't even tell you how many times I've been asked that in my life. My response is always, are you hitting on me? Right? Because if you're not hitting on me, I'm not sure why you need to know what's going on in my pants, right? Yeah. So,
I think we had a closer relationship. She did not ask me that. And I'm glad. I would have been like, oh.
Yeah. Calling HR.
We're much closer than that. Okay. Here's another thing I've learned and struggle with. Because it is, to me, this is referred to as a community, right? The LGBTQ plus community. So you've got, all of it's sort of a community with different streets, let's call it, right? A neighborhood with different streets. As I have seen, and obviously Martina Navratilova is probably the most high profile person that has said, listen, I don't think this is right. And just watching, as somebody that's might live on a different street, but is in that community, I think that's my view. And the amount of blowback for her as a member of that community, really mean-spirited, and I've learned all sorts of new acronyms during this process. Is labeled a TERF. I've never heard TERF in my life. TERF for those listening. That's a trans exclusionary radical feminist. That's pretty hurtful stuff. And here you have, Martina's. She's Martina, right? It would be like Serena today, but this is one community, right? And the world is trying to decide how we best support this community. And you're watching this going, well, hang on, they're in the same community. She took a view that's her view, and look at what happened to her, right? I struggle with that. When you break down TERF, those are pretty harsh words.
There are so many things to say about this conversation specifically.
I know, it's messy.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the most important piece to understand is that we are a very diverse community. We are not a monolith. Just like a beautiful big family, we do not agree on everything. We sometimes fight openly and publicly. But I think what it really comes down to is, how are we working to build understanding about people in our community who are different from us? And what I remember from the situation with Martina is, and it absolutely got ugly. But there were also, I think what people felt so hurt by was some of the language she used in calling trans women cheaters and some really strong language. And I think we also need to examine the words and the assumptions we're making about one another. And it really comes down to not knowing or having an understanding of lived experience and not just an unpopular opinion. And I think that's the difference. I think, and one of the reasons why it's so challenging often, especially for trans folks in this space, to have these conversations is because everybody wants to talk about the transgender debate, the transgender issue, which is essentially talking about debating our lives and our humanity. And should Chris and I and any trans person live full lives that includes access to sport? So it becomes very personal very quickly for so many of us. And not everyone has the capacity or patience or, so many other things to be able to deal with that on a daily basis.
Or they do support up to a point, right? And that's been my journey as well. And I've been, I think, very honest about that with you all. Because look, from my standpoint, I think most people are saying, would say, hey, whatever's in your heart and soul and you believe since whether you were 2 or 12 or 22, it doesn't matter. Let's go. And then we get to this issue of sport. And there will be people that scratch their head and go, I don't know about that. And then the other side jumps in, well, you're a transphobe, you're a bigot, because I've been called these things. It crosses that line so fast. And this is how this all started. Like how we even, Martina said what she said, shade was thrown. Carol Hooven said what she said about biology and was let go from Harvard. Stephen Joyner said what he said about testosterone and was let go from the Mayo Clinic. The philosopher, I'm spacing her name, the philosopher in England. There's real world consequences for just that part. I'm so mind fucked on that thing. Like I can't understand how it's going. But meanwhile, the only one that I've got her name here, the only one I can think of that's really suffered any consequence is Veronica Ivy, who said some pretty nasty things on Twitter, from what I gather, really pretty mean-spirited things. But that's kind of it. But meanwhile, other folks can't say, listen, I support the community, but I don't know about the sports thing, or should we look more at the sports thing, or without it's immediately, you're a transphobe, you're a bigot. Those are serious words.
It really speaks to where we're at in society right now. And I think
agree.
Like social media, Twitter is largely, the place where a lot of these quote unquote debates or the arguments back and forth, the all caps name calling is happening online. And so we know that that's not necessarily about trans people. This happens for every issue, but trans people have become politicized. And the truth is, my identity, my existence is not political. It has been politicized by people trying to use this topic, and specifically trans people in sports, as a wedge in a voter base. And we're currently seeing presidential candidates running their entire campaign on hating LGBTQ people. We're seeing governors in states, their whole agenda is to harm LGBTQ people and specifically transgender people. And that's evident by the number of bills that have been introduced this year. Just over 80 sports bans we've seen. Is it over 600 anti-LGBT bills now?
Over 550.
Over 550 anti-LGBTQ bills introduced in our country this year alone. And so we know this is a hot topic for people and something specifically around sport. And I think it's really great that you brought that up, that your thought about, or that you've heard people say, well, I can support you to a point, but sports is a different thing. And I think,
or even, I'm not sure. You don't have to come out, look, when I started this process, I'm going to, again, just be totally honest. I was like, absolutely not. It's the Leah Thomas situation. That's just, I'm a little biased because I grew up swimming and I feel like I know it so well. I've come into this with eyes wide open, and nuance is a word that I'm totally cool to live with and think about. But it doesn't have to be absolutely not. It could be, I don't know. I need to learn a little more. We need to think more about that.
Well, I would also say, and just before you jump back in, I think actually the majority of the conversations that I've seen on social media have not been, well, actually, I'm confused about the sports thing, or can we have a conversation? It's actually, and some of those folks you mentioned have been really inflammatory. And it hasn't just been like I have a difference of opinion and let's have a conversation about it. It's been a very different tenure. And so I think we are not at a place as a country right now where we can talk about the gray area, which is all of our lives in all of sports. I mean, we all love sports because sports are inherently unfair. That's why we love some of the greatest athletes of all time. And when we think about fairness, and we can talk about Leah more, there are so many ways in which people have advantage in sports, and we don't measure those in eligibility criteria.
Right.
Money, access to training, resources, et cetera.
Yeah.
And
you hear a lot of that. And,
yeah.
I can see some of that. I think my view on that one is that most of the greats had to really kick and fight and scream and claw their way to the top. Like the ones who were entitled and had the silver spoon. None of those are the GOAT ever, and from what I've seen. So there is that. But I'd love to hear that. You just brought up, what was your name again? I'd love to hear. You just referenced the lady.
Leah.
Leah. And just before we get there, just on the the science, and having studied sort of Carol's work, and just reading what Joyner had said. I mean, they are working off what they have spent their life working on, and from what this is where I get really upset, frankly, really upset that by saying, look, this is what I know. This is evolutionary human biology. We have taught this for, I don't know, as long as we've been learning. To be singled out and essentially canceled, it just seems extreme. Okay, that's your view. But it goes too, that to me is too far. I don't, and it seems unfair.
I agree. And I think that having this be a debate at all is deeply unfair. I think about it. It must feel horrible to be canceled. It must feel horrible to
We can talk offline.
I'll pick your brain later, but yeah. So
you're not going to be canceled.
I'm sure that is not a great feeling. I can also speak from personal experience and say it is not a great feeling to feel that people who have no skin in the game here, people who are not affiliated with sports, who are not my governing body, have an opinion and also have a violent intent to like really force that opinion against me that impacts my ability to live safely and happily in this world. So yes, I think it's awful that people get canceled. I also know that it's very difficult for our community, and specifically for young people right now, to live safe, open, and happy lives because of the impacts of this quote unquote debate. So when we're hearing people say things that are just untrue or that are, denying, like the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport report that goes through all of the different studies that have been out about trans women and picks it apart. When we're denying that exists and just going, researchers can find and support their hypothesis by picking and choosing the data that they want. That's just something that happens in research. And I'm not saying that happens with the research that you're talking about, but the truth is it's just not that clear cut on this topic. And so when we have debates, when we have news segments, when we have, even in some ways, like this podcast series that you're doing does create an environment where people will hear quote unquote all sides. And some of those sides are actually saying that we do not deserve to live safe, happy, and open lives, and to have the same access to sport
as it includes sport
as our peers. But I think what's deeply unfair about that is, take the example of a kid, right? So we have trans kids in school. To say that a trans girl can be seen as a girl and we'll treat her like a girl from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m., but then she has to be a boy in sports after school, that just doesn't make sense. And so the idea of I can accept you in some places, but not all places, it does become really problematic for us to be able to live our lives. And at the end of the day, every young person should be able to be who they are. And I would say every adult too, to be who they are and to do what they love. And
I've seen, and I touched on it at the start of the show, like it feels, just in kind of listening and learning and talking, it feels like people separate those things, right? If it's the 7th grade soccer team, they can say, okay, all right, no problem. If it's an Olympic medal, then they start to get more, I think people are
I wish that was true, but talk about Canada.
Yeah, I mean, I've been at this a month, and you guys have been at it for a lot longer. So, but it feels like people can separate those two. But again, I might be missing it.
I would love, and I have to believe that's true to continue to do the work that we do. Mm-hmm. But just 2 weeks ago at this point in Canada, there was a father thrown out of a game in British Columbia at an elementary school track meet for screaming at a young girl because he thought that she was trans, screaming at her parents, saying, I want to see her birth certificate. And this is why I keep coming back to, this harms all women, because what we're saying is, if you look different, if your hair is short, if you're too big, if you're too fast, if you're too strong, then there's no way you can actually be a woman, because you will have competed yourself out of the women's category. Mm. And I don't believe that about women athletes. And I really want us to problematize and complicate how we're thinking about this, because we are all being harmed by narratives that are policing how we look and how we show up in the world.
That's a perfect segue. If I look at this, and I always look at, I like to fight. I'm a fighter. So let's just call it a fight, or this effort, let's call it an effort. If I were sitting in y'all seats and you're looking at this effort, right? And it's almost more just the entire thing, including sports, but everything. In y'all's estimation, how is it going? Is sport making it harder? Because sport is sort of this lightning rod right now. You all are fighting the community is fighting for 50 different things. But sport is this one thing that's, and we've actually talked a little about this before, but I also think it's one that people are using to keep it on all the networks and keep it to piss people off. But overall, and I'm going to share something. I can even show. I have a picture of it on my phone. I was watching CNN last week, and this blew me away. And it was CNN posted a poll, and again, this is CNN. This isn't Fox. Although I do make my kids watch all the things. Like we normally do watch. That, we normally do watch CNN, but I'm like, all right, now I got to listen to the other side, and we bounce back and forth. But this is on CNN, and it was a Wall Street Journal poll. And the question was, has America gone too far in accepting the trans community? So summer of 2020, which is 3 years ago, 15% of America said we've gone too far. Just last week, so summer of 2023, 43% say we've gone too far. You guys know what that number means. I mean, I look at that and I'm like, what is happening? Something is happening, right? Is it the push for sports? Is it Bud Light? Is it that it's Pride Month? I mean, it could be, I don't know why. I'm like, How did it go from, that's a big jump. 15 in 3 years. 3 years is nothing. 15% to 43%. Just so you believe me. I don't know if you guys probably saw this.
Yeah. I mean, I think it really speaks to where we're at as a country again. And I'm going to keep coming back to this, because if you really zoom out of the issue of trans people in sports, And I mean, look at the tagline there, right? Look at who's quoted on the bottom of that screen there.
This is, oh, well.
And this is.
I couldn't control that. Yeah. Donald Trump says, I don't like the term woke. It's just a term they use. Half the people, that's not supposed to be associated with the poll.
Yeah. But it does speak to where I think, how we got ourselves in this situation is if you look at our country and how we're divided on a variety of issues, not just about LGBTQ issues, I would say those numbers have probably jumped in the same way because the truth is we are more divided as a country than ever before in our lifetimes, at least, I think right now. And that is because people live in their echo chambers. And, a lot of this has been propaganda and it's been recycled over and over again. There are studies that show that for articles about the trans community and specifically about transgender athletes, that over 80%, probably closer to 90% of them never talk to an actual trans person and never talk to a person from an organization that supports trans people. So what we have then is 90% of articles about whether or not I should be able to play sports, or more specifically, if a trans woman should be allowed to play women's sports, is actually just propaganda pieces from people who don't want to see us in sports at all. And I think that the sports issue is not really, it has become the issue that people have found to be the lightning rod. And that's why it gets clicks.
I think it's a big one.
It gets clicks, it gets views, and that's been tested. But this is actually not really, if you look at the big picture, it's not really about trans people in sports. And I don't even think it's about trans people having access to medical care that they need or about talking about LGBTQ people in school curriculums. This is really a concerted effort from conservatives and specifically the Republican Party trying to get trans people not to exist safely in our country right now. Mm-hmm. And that's why it's so important to be able to talk about this issue and think about the young people who are just trying to play sports with their friends, or the recreational athletes who are out there trying to build community and have fun as an adult, because those are the people who are actually playing sports. We'll focus on the 2 or 3 people who have won something and really dial in on them. And, we'll have tons of articles. It's a global controversy if a trans person has any level of success in their sport. But the people who are really being impacted here are your everyday average 99.9% of the people who will never be professional or elite athletes. And it's not only impacting us in sport, but in our ability to leave our houses safely, to go to the grocery store, to engage in social activities like our peers. And that's why this is a really important topic.
Yeah. And I'm also reminded, and I read this the other day, which was actually just completely fucking mind-blowing, that in 2011, both Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton opposed same-sex marriage. I mean, yeah, I almost fell off my chair. And now we're here in 2023. And so I look at that, I'm like, that curve has gone the complete opposite. I'm trying to understand. There's something there.
I think, again, what it really goes back to is so many people don't believe that they know or have ever met a trans person. And again, that's why I think your story is really powerful, because you're having this very human and messy allyship journey, right? And not a lot of people either have that or give themselves permission to do this in a very public way or do it at all. And, as Chris was saying, there are very real consequences for what's happening at the federal level and state legislatures. We were just in Seattle for a big student athlete activism summit and met a sweet, sweet trans kid who was brought into the box of a professional sports team because he had just been bullied by his coach. And this is in a place like Seattle. And I was talking to his mom who, just like all parents, wants to be there and support her kid. And, her kid is now a teenager, which is all other sorts of issues as a parent. And just really,
I've had a lot of them. I'm right? Well aware. Then you throw in social media. I mean, the right. Social media part is
right. But it's a very relatable human experience to want to support your kid and want to protect your kid. And that's also really what I want people to take away from this, is that even though trans people, we are different, we are also very similar. I sometimes joke with Chris that I wish we could do, in Us Weekly, they have the stars. They're just like us. They go to the grocery store. Right. They walk their dogs. I feel like we need that kind of a moment to really humanize and show that overall we are trying to be divided as a country and we can make a different choice.
By the way, they don't go to the store. Did I tell you? Because we talked. This is a true story. This is no shit right here. We talked right before I went on my little retreat and turned my phone to, and then. But I was not like in a teepee. I was staying in a house. I just was disconnected and just doing some work, and so I had to go get food. But I was by myself. And Dave, you'll get a kick out of this. And so before I turned my phone, I told my wife, I was like, I don't even know the last time I went to a grocery store. So I'm like, I gotta go down. I was buying frozen pizzas and fucking M&Ms and fucking Diet Coke. And so I get there and I'm like, pull up, put the stuff on, it's going across, and I'm just standing there, ready to pay. And the lady's like, hey, you gonna put the stuff in the bag? And I was like, what? I was so lost. I was like, wait, okay. I was so proud that I made it that far. She's like, yo, you got to put the stuff in the bag. And I was like, I do? I mean.
See, for all of your listeners and viewers, trans people are actually more relatable than you are.
Yeah. I was like, yeah, I'm on it. Yeah, I didn't know. So shit. She's like, I know she was thinking, this guy's what do you mean you don't know? But
I'm new here.
That's a true story.
That's really funny.
Okay,
so maybe not grocery stores, but walking dogs, watching kids' sports games. Yeah. So I think that's a really big piece is humanizing trans people.
Is there a world, and I've heard it a lot, and of course Roger Pilkey, who you guys know well, was on the show, and he could look at this with a very nuanced approach and sort of do separate the youth and the elite, or separate sport by sport. Certainly combat, and you're a fighter. I mean, is there any, in y'all's view, is there an option to go sport by sport, or that gets, admittedly, I think that's really complicated. I don't know that people will understand that either, but is there a lens there that says, well, let's just break it down, whereas boxing is different than archery, is different than track and field, is different than cycling. Is that a place we could get to?
I think we have to start getting to a place where we're having more nuanced and more complex conversations about sports generally, but absolutely when it comes to eligibility criteria. What makes me a good Muay Thai fighter?
And personal safety. I mean, let's be honest. I mean, if Mike Tyson decided to be Michelle Tyson, somebody's getting hurt, right? Back in the day, maybe not now. You probably kick his ass now, but you hear a lot about personal safety, we definitely have to protect. That's different than a triathlon or a swimming race when you're in a lane all by yourself.
And we all can agree that safety and health and well-being of athletes is of utmost importance, which is why we need to be having these conversations in a nuanced way, because it's often, when we work with sport governing bodies, we want to look at this holistically and make sure, like we were having the conversation about Leah Thomas earlier, the NCAA Board of Governors changed policies mid-season specifically to target Leah. So no matter what anybody thinks about Leah and Leah's participation in swimming, that's a really dangerous precedent to set for student athletes, that you're going to change policy mid-season and potentially disrupt somebody's very limited years of eligibility in the NCAA.
But then how did it go that she then competed at the national championships?
Because there was so much pushback for the mid-season change that she was then allowed to compete, then FINA changed their policy.
I did not know that.
But and also, that was a really interesting moment where a lot of administrators, again, no matter where you are on this issue, they said, you can't do this to our student athletes. And it's a dangerous precedent to set. And so I think the sport by sport piece is going to be important moving forward. But also, we need to be having different conversations based on the level of sport. Youth level K through 12 sport, when we're really talking about the benefits of sport participation for young kids. I mean, neither Chris nor I would be sitting here today without team sports. And I joke about this. I played basketball and lacrosse growing up, and I was terrible. I mean, when I say I was bad, it was the kid on the team where you're like, oh, they're just trying their best. That was me through and through. But it didn't matter because that was the only time during the day where I could pause and take a breath and feel in my body when I spent most of my time totally disassociated because I didn't understand my sexual orientation or gender identity growing up in Pittsburgh in the 90s. Again, similar to what Chris shared. And so we need to think about level of sport and also the purpose of sport for particular age groups, because at the end of the day, we want all of our kids to be able to participate and live happy, healthy, active lives. But I'm sure you might have something to add to that.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, yeah. Look, the fear is just as I've observed it, and you kind of look around. I mean, you talk about Renee Richards. I mean, it was a long time ago, right? And Leah Thomas was a year or two ago. That's the fear that, and I've said this to y'all, I think before, like, hey, okay. But if I'm wondering, I'm staying out of this right for now, right? But I would wonder what.
You are very much in this, just to be clear.
I know, but just for the purpose of this one point, I'm going to pretend like I'm staying out of it.
Okay.
If I don't know what could possibly imagine to be the biggest women's sporting moment of the year, every 4 years, the Olympics. I wonder what it's one of these things, like, sort of, you would almost say, like, be careful what you wish for, because you don't, again, just imagining if a trans woman won the 100-meter dash and won Wimbledon all in the same year and won whatever, right? I think people would, I'm just guessing, but I think people go, wait, what happened? Like, then it's not 50 years ago, and it's not, by the way, as much as I love swimming and as much as I love the 500 free, like, nobody really follows swimming, right? But fast forward to potentially a moment in time where it's the entire world is watching. I mean, that's a moment in time that if we think it's hot now, hot. Really hot.
I think what it really highlights for me is this idea that one trans person winning one event is too much for a lot of people. And those are the people who are really divided on this issue and have already made up their minds that they don't believe that we belong in sport at all, period. But we have these policies from national governing bodies, from sports international federations that say there is a pathway to participate. And so when you have an athlete who follows all of the steps, which are not easy steps, by the way. There are a lot of hoops to jump through for trans women to participate basically at any level of play, except for the most inclusive states at, like, youth levels. So when we look at that, we see that it is really challenging to get to the starting line, even as a trans woman. And, if we have any level of success, that's when people hear about it. But there are trans athletes who've been participating for decades and fit in with their peers. And trans athletes are just like any other athlete. I'd say, we can win sometimes, we can lose sometimes, but it feels deeply unfair to me to say, okay, you as a trans athlete, you're welcome to play, you just can't be good, right? You're welcome to participate, and even if you meet all the criteria, just don't be successful. So, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, but also let's talk about the numbers, right? The IOC had their first trans inclusion policy for the 2004 Olympics. Between 2004 and 2018, okay, you had over 50,000 athletes. Not a single one of those athletes was openly transgender. Fast forward to Tokyo 2020, technically 2021, thanks COVID. And you had a few trans athletes. Only 2 of those athletes were trans women. One was a lifter. The other was a BMX rider. Who's wonderful, Chelsea Wolfe. And Chelsea was an alternate on the Olympic team. So the only person that competed was Laurel Hubbard out of New Zealand. That is one person in over 11,000 athletes in the Olympics.
Right.
Not even talking about Paralympics, just the Olympics. Yeah. So we are so far away from, if it ever happens, a time where we have a trans woman winning Wimbledon, medaling. Right. I mean, there's.
I was just riffing, but yeah.
But I think it's a concern that people have.
And again, I'm probably too close. It's obviously a big story in cycling, right? This is the sport that I really came from, or for better or worse. And it's obviously a very sensitive subject, and we saw just yesterday in the national championship, Austin Kilps. And there's, other, and also different age divisions. I sort of look at like, okay, the Masters 35 to whatever, like, but it's a hotter topic in cycling now. But yeah, that's the fear, is that does happen. But those numbers don't lie as well. But people play it out and say, there's more and more, and then that will happen.
Yeah. And that's something we've seen for, again, decades, I think, is that there's this fear casting where people are projecting and saying those examples. Mike Tyson wants to box, or LeBron James wants to go to the WNBA, or a football linebacker wants to play volleyball with your high school daughter. Like, those are the scenarios that we're hearing on a daily basis, which are just, one, absurd, and it's not happening. And two, the numbers, again, are just not there. So like, our youth numbers are a great example of this. In our states across the country that have introduced and subsequently passed anti-trans sport bills into law, there are a handful of kids in these states. So in Utah, the governor vetoed the bill, citing that there were only 4 trans kids in the whole state playing sports, and only one of them was a trans girl. And unfortunately, they overrode the veto, and that is now a law. In Wyoming, you have 2 trans girls in that state. In several states, 1 transgender athlete. And in many states, the lawmakers can't name a single trans kid, or the state high school athletic association will say, yeah, we haven't had a single request for trans athletes to participate. So at the youth level, we're now telling kids that they can't be who they are and play the sports that they love. And, they're already not there. They're underrepresented in sport, in every sport, at every level of play, because sport doesn't feel like a safe place for them. And that's a much deeper issue. And again, to complicate this even more, we have to be thinking about the inherent sexism and misogyny that's a part of sports, and that sort of internalized homophobia that's a part of sports. Like, I'm not sure of your experience prior to like triathlon, but maybe just playing in the neighborhood, right? The things that we heard when we were kids were that, don't be a sissy, man up. Like, that's what my brother was told, a very specific certain type of masculinity that they were trying to impose on him. For me as a young girl athlete, it was like, okay, play, but don't get dirty, right? Don't try too hard. Oh, you don't have to be so competitive. It's not really a big deal if
you're a tomboy.
And yeah, as a tomboy, but still, I wasn't prioritized in the same way. We treat kids differently in the youth sport level, even. And what that does is it creates an unsafe environment for any person who, say, a gay male in sports. We're still on this conversation of breaking the closet barrier in professional men's athletics. Right. And that is deeply tied to this issue because of the way that people view a certain type of masculinity and a certain type of athleticism as being superior. And oftentimes that means that a gay male or somebody who's more effeminate would be seen as a woman, which then ties into this conversation of saying that any woman, any person assigned female at birth is a lesser athlete. And if they, to Anne's point earlier, achieve some sort of level of success in athletics, that they compete themselves out of the women's category, essentially.
Your journey must have been, I'm just imagining this, but I mean, you're not showing up to a race and like, let's imagine Leah Thomas here, where we know what people say. Chris, you show up to a race, assigned female at birth, and it beat everybody. I mean, what do they say? Like, do they say, well, this is bullshit. You're a girl, or, or do they go, cool, good race. Like it has, wildly different, has to be.
Yeah, wildly different.
Yeah.
Wildly different. And yeah, thank you for asking that, because I think it highlights the difference, not only in my experience and Leah's or any trans woman who just wants to get to the starting line faces exponential amounts of discrimination and harassment. I can make Team USA again or win and, be named All-American. And it's completely under the radar. And sure, I'll get some people, talking about my sports or talking about my stats or whatever. Those folks want to take a deep dive. But essentially it is that I don't support the narrative that anyone assigned female at birth could never be competitive with men. And so, my story doesn't help push forward this idea of not including people. I think that sports can be safe and fair and inclusive all at the same time. And we really don't have to separate it. It's not an either it is safe and inclusive, or safe or fair. You know, all of these things can happen together. And I think that that's what's really important when we're looking at making sport accessible to all people, is that you will have people assigned male at birth who are horrible athletes. You will have people with high levels of testosterone that are terrible in sports. And so the assumptions, the stereotypes that we're working within are really what has become so problematic. And it hurts all people, not just trans people, and all women and girls.
I think that's a great way to end it. I mean, it's that meets politics, meets science, that we're still, there's more evidence, meets societal things.
I think the evidence piece is pretty important. Do you want to talk about the CCES report quickly?
Sure. So, and also Dr. Chung, who is working with the IOC now, released a new study as well that I brought for you because it's fresh off the press. I haven't even read it all the way through yet. But so in November of last year, the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport put out a literature review of all of the research that we currently have, between 2011 and that last fall, focused on trans women in elite sports. And I really encourage everybody to go and read that report, also because part of what we would love everyone to take away from this is critical thinking and asking questions. And if you are more confused now than when we started this conversation, that is a beautiful thing, because we are not going to get clarity on everything anytime soon, but we want to be asking questions. But the CCS report is a great roll up of all the data that we have. And I think the top line from that report is, what we do know is that there is no evidence to justify banning trans women outright from sport. And this is why it's important to go back to all of the policies in place all of the policies that have been in place for decades with no issue. And again, just really want to encourage folks to do the reading, look up all of your guests, and really engage.
Yeah, I mean, it's, and I read the report. I lie. I mean, I read the executive summary. I'm not gonna. That's what I tell people all the time. I'm just not very smart. But if you give me an executive summary,
you say that, but you're curious and you're smart.
It's like a tick. I don't know. I just say it. But I mean, you guys sent it. I printed it out. But and I'm just gonna play devil's advocate for a second. Then you come across. Oh boy, where'd it go? This piece here by Divine, Hilton, Howe, Imzovich, Lundberg, and Pike.
I'm so glad you brought that piece up.
Which as I read most, I'd also be lying if I said I read the whole thing, but I read a lot of it.
So if you, in the CCS report, they actually dedicate an entire appendix just to that report, because it is so methodologically flawed and is essentially an argumentative essay. And so this is I'm so happy you brought this up, because this is a study that people go to. And so we have to be critical thinkers to really make sure that we are forming our own opinions. And, Chris and I say this after we also do the reading on all sides of the issue. We engage with things as they come out. And it's very, very important that we continue as a country, as a society, to think critically and engage with one another as human beings.
Yeah.
And that includes checking our sources as well. So if there's something it's really incredibly difficult to find legitimate sources on this, because people do have really strong opinions. There are organizations, nonprofits that are dedicated solely to trying to keep trans people out of sport. And those can seem very legitimate when you see the roster of people involved, or when you see some of the things that they put out. But we need to be really critically thinking and seeing, are they speaking with trans people? Are trans and non-binary people part of this conversation? Because otherwise it becomes an opinion piece. We really need more data and studies about trans people specifically, because that is one of the criticisms.
That's very consistent. That always, even somebody that says absolutely not, that they will agree with that 100%, which it makes sense. This is almost, it's. I'm not religious at all, but this is almost like a religious thing. Like it's so mean, polarizing is too general, but it's just so dug in, and we've seen the blowback for folks that even, we talked about opinions. I mean, whether it's an opinion or what you study forever or it's your job, and it's religious. It's and the consequences for some folks have been really high. I just having been one of those people, I struggle with that. It's like, agree to, there's not a sort of agree to disagree at all.
I think it's also important to talk to some folks in the trans community who have been targeted and canceled too, because I think we hear more about the folks that you mentioned being canceled, but there are a whole host of people who are targeted. I mean, including you, Chris. I mean, Chris has gotten death threats very recently. And so I think, I have to believe that nobody wants to be where we are in terms of this level of vitriol and violence. And it's just, we have to remember, we have to go back to, at the end of the day, there are human beings here on both sides, but it's really about centering people's humanity.
Okay, last thing, and maybe not the last thing, but this is one thing. This was my view early on, and I've used, you do hear this from time to time. The idea of an open category, a separate category, a different division, however we call it, still gives, all of these things, all of these freedoms and outlets, and all of the beautiful things that we all love about sport. It gives, you would hope. But that's not a very popular idea of an open division or a separate category. And why not?
Part of the problem is just numbers. As I mentioned, all of those numbers of the young people in their states, how would they have a meaningful experience like their peers if they were just them playing? And particularly for team sports, which is so important for young people to make those connections, to learn about communication and teamwork together.
But you could argue we're talking about the result, right? So the way I looked at sports was a game of process. The thing I loved about my sport, and people hear me talk, take it for what it's worth. I loved the process. I hated the job. Like, I knew I had to go win the Tour de France, but those days in the mountains, all alone, that was the process, and that's what I loved. That was my therapy. I had to go race, and you had to be competitive, and you had to try and win. And I was like, okay, good, that's over. Now let's go back to the process. So I hear you, Chris, it'd be hard to have a 100-meter dash with one people or two people. But you would still have the process, which is that association or that alignment with the community and being physical and all of the things.
It is targeting a specific number of, small number of people though. And I often hear this about myself, of people saying, well, you should just be in a trans only category, right? Or an open category. But in my sport at my level, I'd be competing against myself. And I love the process too. But on race day, I want to see how I stack up against the other men. And so to take away that part of sport almost says that maybe we need to take away prizes and categories and podiums for everybody, because if we don't, then and I'm not advocating for that, by the way. That's not my stance here. But otherwise we are doing that to one or two people, and that's still making them excluded from the general goals of sport. So I think it's really important that we find ways to meaningfully include people and to make sure that they're having that same experience as their peers and not having to compromise their identity in order to do that.
And also, just to add to that too, because we were talking about safety before, it is very unsafe to put trans people in their own category in this political climate in the US or globally. I mean, we've had conversations about kids that have been outed on social media accounts run by adults, been threatened at high school track meets. And so putting somebody in their own category is really alienating. And that's, again, not the experience we want for sport. There is a difference, though, between having an open category and having a non-binary category, for example, like we see in running. And that has been really successful. And you've been more involved in the running community. So if you want to talk about the non-binary category.
But you're obligated to race in that category?
No.
That's the thing. Like they have this at Unbound, the gravel race, they had, I looked at the start list, the men's start list, women's start list, and non-binary. But you weren't obligated. If you could sign up, if you identified as a woman, you sign up in the women's race.
Yep.
I think there was one person in the non-binary.
And that's really affirming, for us to be our authentic selves and to be able to exist in the sports that we love as our full selves. That's why I play sports. To have that non-binary category and allow people to opt in is incredibly affirming, because for a lot of people, they don't feel like they fit into one of those two checkboxes. And this is probably a learning point for some of the audience too, that not every trans person makes a quote unquote binary transition. So I was assigned female at birth. I have this incredible handlebar mustache, compete in the men's category, navigate the world as a man. And I feel very comfortable with that. I'm a trans man. And that's where I think the men's category is where I belong. Even if I was presented with the option to race in a non-binary category, I wouldn't, because it doesn't fit my identity any more than the women's category would. But for a lot of people who are non-binary, that feels like a great way for them to meaningfully participate in sport, because those places are giving podiums, they are giving prizes, our world marathon majors now are actually matching prize money for the non-binary category as well. So, and at least
that would
podium
get them
spots.
to sign up.
So, but the thing is that people aren't flip-flopping or being inauthentic about that. There's literally nothing to gain for a man who's not transgender to pretend that he's trans to try to win in an open category. And I think that's an important call out, because a lot of people presume, I think, you mentioned cheating, like draw the line to cheating or some sort of unfair, you couldn't swing it as a male athlete, so now you're going to pretend to be a woman to try to win in sports. And the truth is that there is no gold medal, NCAA championship, high school, medal that would offset the dangers and the harassment and discrimination that trans people, and specifically trans women and black and brown trans women face every single day.
I don't think anybody, let me speak for, I've often thought of Leah Thomas, what was it? And I think I've asked that in a few of these shows, like, what is she thinking? I'm wondering, like, what is going through her mind on the top step? And because I don't know, but I doubt that she's like, I fucked over all these girls. I don't think that's, no, I don't think that at all, but that's not, and if anybody ever did think that way, then they have a serious problem. But you do, it's natural to be like, how does that, what is, but I do not think that Leah Thomas thinks, well, I was the 400 ranked male swimmer, so now I'm a winner. I mean, that's sick.
And also what people don't know about Leah is that Leah has always been a phenomenal athlete. Mm-hmm. And so post-transition, Leah was going to be a phenomenal athlete. And she also worked her butt off. Mm-hmm. And she won one event in championships. And she tied for 5th place in others with Riley Gaines and came in dead last in other places. So again, it's far more gray than people understand or are seeing in the mainstream media. But she talk about pulling herself up and working her butt off. She did that. And also we want to be able to celebrate her for working so hard.
I also think about just, imagine what it would be like to be her, a 21-year-old girl who is just trying to play the sports that she loves and also then becomes a center of global controversy.
Yeah,
absolutely. And we know it's hard enough to be a young person. And you probably know better having kids who are young people, right? Like what their experience is like now in school with social media, with the pressure to look a certain way, act a certain way, be seen as a certain type of person. To just try to survive in school is difficult enough for young people. To then try to be your authentic self and figure out who you are and do that on the world stage, which NCAA is not. NCAA swimming, like you said, people didn't care about that.
But it became a big story.
Became a huge story.
Yeah.
And so I, think that when we're having this conversation, those are examples that a lot of people will know. Leah and Austin, people have heard of these folks, but to single out just an individual to have this quote unquote debate or to theorize about how a person is feeling or thinking, it we have to remember at the end of the day, these are people that we're talking about, and real people with real emotions who are not only trying to figure out themselves and are doing it in the spotlight. And I think that sort of courage that we've seen from these athletes is really impressive.
Mm-hmm. And also who didn't ask to be put there.
Right.
And I think that's something that we all forget, is that people like Leah, even Laurel Hubbard, and so many other athletes have been put on a stage that they never asked to be on. They just wanted to live their full and authentic lives. And so I also hope that folks understand that not everybody wants to be an activist, wants to be the sole representation of their community.
I wouldn't want it either.
Yeah. And so that's also just something we want to keep in mind.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Guys, thank you. I look forward to putting these out. I look forward to it's so, and wherever people sit on it, it seems so strange that we're just like, people clam up, they run out of the room. I just don't think we get anywhere. And I don't know where there is. Yeah. But I don't like to think about where there is if nobody's going to talk about it and at least have a dialogue.
And how we talk about it is so important, because in some of those rooms, and even though, unlike Leah, I did put myself in a position to be an activist, and we do have these conversations. We are the people that we want to be asked these questions, to have these conversations. And still there are cases where, having this conversation feels like a direct attack on my ability to exist, and less so for me as a trans man, as a white person, versus a Black trans woman or any person from the global South. Or a cisgender woman, a non-transgender woman who also is more masculine or too athletic, right? These conversations impact so many of us, but in some of these cases, it can feel really hostile, with some of the names that you mentioned earlier and how they engage on social media and the platforms that they take about their opinion about whether or not trans people deserve access to the same opportunities as their peers and that ability to live safe and full and happy and open lives. And so I think it's really important how we engage from this point forward. This is going to be out there. What are the next steps for your audience to take? And I think in investigating and doing a little educational work on their own is really important. As we mentioned, checking your sources and doing the research and not just following the tweets and the headlines, because it is such a polarizing conversation. So I hope that everybody can listen to this with an open heart. And
we tried to do as best I could, a 360 on the issue. So, and then people can take it from there and decide or search further. But thanks for coming.
Thank you so much for having us.
And thanks for you guys have helped a lot. I will say you've helped. We have our own, forget sports for a second, but we've had our own personal journey with this, and you've been a big help.
I'm so glad, and hopefully we can still be a resource. Because
100%.
The ally journey. I was just saying I was saying that we were in Seattle, and I was just talking to another mom of a trans kid, and we were like, yeah, ally journeys are messy and they're not linear, and we make mistakes, and that's okay.
Yeah,
we have to believe that people can change. Ann and I wouldn't be doing this work if we didn't believe fundamentally that people can learn new information and change their thoughts and opinions and do better. And so, I think this is a great starting point, and not even a starting point for you, a point along your journey, but also for so many people who maybe would never tune into a podcast that talked about this topic to now have the exposure to different points of view. And
I think some people got tipped off in the last couple of days. So hopefully, everyone was like, "Oh, that must suck. They're flaming you on Twitter." And I was like, "More downloads. Fuck it. I don't care." Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.